Okay, this lecture 3, we're going to kind of apply some of the things that we've been talking about, how the Messiah faced external enemies and internal fears based on the Psalms. We'll focus on those things related to the life of the Messiah and how they are reflected in the life of Christ. We'll also briefly examine what this means for us as we face enemies without and fears within. So this might be maybe a more devotional approach as we apply this and think about Christ. And you do have a handout, and what I have on the handout is just some general categories that we're going to look at. And it again, we're going to be looking at some Psalms. So some of these Psalms we'll spend just a little bit of time in. So if you want to turn to those Psalms, it might help you kind of follow along a little bit better. But sort of to show that this is kind of an application of what we looked at, I'm going to give you a list of the major Psalms here that I'm going to refer to, and I'm going to characterize them for you. So I'm going to look at two Messianic Psalms, 69, 22. I'm going to look at three Psalms quoted in the New Testament, but don't always make the list, 31, 35, 41. Now, 41 does make Van Groningen's list, but then I'm going to look at two Psalms that are alluded to in the New Testament by the apostles, 6 and 88. And then I'm going to look at three Psalms not referred to in the New Testament at all related to Christ, 3, 7, and 55. So I'm going to apply, using those three Psalms, that yes, we can use Psalms in reference to Christ that the apostles maybe have not done. So just sort of put that out there as a partial explanation. Also, a lot of this lecture was prepared for a chapter in an upcoming book. I think you got the bibliography there. It's not been published yet. Edited by David and Jonathan Gibson. They're editing 5 volumes on Tulip. And this one is entitled Safe in the Arms of Sovereign Love, Preserving Grace, Persevering Faith in Historical, Biblical, Theological, and Pastoral Perspective, published by Crossway, forthcoming. So this lecture is sort of a condensation or a summary. It's not the whole lecture, but it's taking a lot of the things that I've done in for that chapter and trying to present that here as an application. So we'll go through Psalms, and then we'll see how they apply to the life of Christ, go through Psalms, see how they apply to the life of Christ. We'll kind of do that, and then draw some implications for our lives at the end. So that's kind of where we're going. Okay. How does Messiah deal with external enemies? And general categories. The first one here, general hatred expressed toward the Messiah. So both Psalm 35 and 69 describe the enemy as hating David without cause. 35:19, 69:4. In Psalm 69, I'll spend a little bit of time here on 69. It is a lament psalm. David has been falsely attacked by his family, verse 7, and the community, verse 17. His piety, verses 10 and 11, and his zeal for the temple, verse 9, have become matters of scorn and reproach, verses 10 and 12. Those who hate him without cause are too numerous to count, he says, more than the hairs of my head, and have the power, these enemies have the power to do him great harm in their actions and words, verse 4. Part of the harm that they do is expressed by the word reproach, chirpa, which is used several times in Psalm 69. It has a connotation of casting blame or scorn on someone with insults or taunts that mock the person. David has, quote, borne reproach for the sake of God, verse 7. So much so that he can say, quote, the reproaches of those who reproach you, talking to God, have fallen on me. Verse 9, this scorn by others, even among his family, has to do with David's zeal for God's house. verse 9. We know David had a zeal for the preparation of the building of the temple, 1 Samuel 22, but this zeal probably also included broader things related to the honor of God, such as living faithfully for God. This section, verses 6 through 12 of Psalm 69, gives the picture of a broken community, where many in the community are not that concerned about the things of God, and where one person can be faithful, like David, and suffer for it. Not only does this bring loneliness and internal struggles, verses 10 and 20, but David became the object of ridicule and mockery by both the prominent and the not so prominent members of the community. Verses 11 through 12. Those who sit in the gate represent leaders and elders of the community who ridiculed him through talk that damaged his reputation. Even the drunkards make sport of him through their drunken songs. Okay, then just a brief word about Psalm 35. Psalm 35 adds the kind of actions David's enemies took against him without cause. They hid their nets and dug a pit for David's life. Verse 7, they devise evil against David. They repay David with evil for good. They are malicious witnesses. They rejoice when David stumbles. These statements from Psalms 35 and 69 show how widespread the hatred was toward the Lord's anointed. They set the stage for the many ways hatred was demonstrated and how many different types of people show opposition to the Messiah. Jesus was also hated by many without cause. The general response, they hated me without a cause, is referred to in John 15:25. In the farewell discourse, 13:36 to 16:33 of John's gospel, Jesus turns his attention to the world's opposition against him. References to the world's hatred against Jesus culminates in 15:25, they hated me without a cause. In the face of his imminent death on the cross, Jesus faced many enemies who were very powerful and leveled false charges against him. Their hatred of Jesus without a cause is unfounded and irrational. Just as malicious false witnesses revolted against David, so they brought forward false witnesses who falsely accused Jesus, seeking to justify his death. They hid their nets and were digging a pit for Jesus to fall into, like Psalm 35:7 says. The problem was that the false witnesses did not agree, Mark 14:59, leading Caiaphas to try to get Jesus to incriminate himself. Jesus' statement about the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven, was seen as a statement of blasphemy, deserving of death. And related to this is opposition from his family, as we did see reflected in, well, I'm going to say that here. So David bore reproach for the sake of his commitment to God, and in return experienced opposition from his family, as we saw in Psalm 69, 7 through 8. David actually states, quote, I've become a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my mother's sons. Jesus also experienced opposition from his family because of his commitment to the ministry that God the Father had given him to do. We see this especially in Mark 3:21 and then verses 31 through 35. Although there are no linguistic connections between Psalm 69, 7 and 8 and Mark 3:21, 31 through 35, Jesus' experience has parallels with David's experience. When Jesus' family heard of all of his activities, they went out to seize him, to bring him forcibly back home. The reason is they thought, quote, he's out of his mind. Chapter 3, verse 21. This phrase can describe psychotic derangement, and the word insane can even be used as a description. Lane, in his commentary on Mark, describes the reason behind the concern the family had. Reflection on Jesus' sense of mission, his urgent drive to minister, his failure properly to eat and sleep undoubtedly led the family to their conviction, but it reveals both misunderstanding and unbelief. His family mistakes his zeal for God's work as madness. Psalm 69, 7 through 9. Also, betrayal by a trusted companion. David also experienced betrayal by individuals who were considered close companions and friends. Psalm 41 describes a situation of weakness that includes sickness. Verse 3, so I'm going to say a few words here about Psalm 41. A confession of sin, verse 4, and the enemies who are eager for death to come to David. They maliciously say among themselves, when will he die and his name perish? When one of them comes to visit David in his illness, he speaks empty words, which are words of hollow comfort or even words of lies. This person is two-faced, speaking one thing to David and another thing to those outside, verses 5 and 6. These are, again, Psalm 41. David has many enemies who are acting this way, verse 7. But there was one person who was a close, trusted friend with whom David had experienced fellowship, who also turned against him, expressed in that phrase, has lifted his heel against me, verse 9. Such a terrible act of betrayal by a close friend is also highlighted in Psalm 55. So now I'll move over to Psalm 55, one of these Psalms that doesn't refer to Christ by the apostles in the New Testament. David appeals to God to hear his plea for mercy because of the torment of his enemies, verses 1 through 3. Twice in Psalm 55, an individual enemy is highlighted. The pain of betrayal is expressed in verses 12 through 14. One can endure taunts from an enemy. One can deal with an adversary who shows an arrogant lack of respect by avoiding that person, verse 12. But David has been betrayed by an equal, a companion, a familiar friend, verse 13. This person has stood alongside David as a friend and trusted companion, someone with whom David shared confidential information and experienced the fellowship of worship together, verse 14. In verse 15, David returns to the plural, imploring that his enemies would experience death because evil was so ingrained among them. After a confident appeal to God for divine deliverance, verses 16 through 19, the focus turns to the individual, again, who had betrayed David and others by violating, quote, his covenant. Covenant probably made with David, verse 20. His words were as pleasant as a refreshing bowl of yogurt. That's one way you can translate that. And as soothing as oil applied to a wound, verse 21. He said one thing, but meant something else. Behind pleasant speech was a hostile intent. Behind soothing words were drawn swords. The deceit of betrayal adds to the pain of losing a close friend. Just as David was betrayed by a close companion and friend, Psalms 41 and 45, so Jesus was betrayed by one of his chosen disciples. The accounts in the Synoptic Gospels have several things in common. Matthew 26, 23, Mark 14, 18, and Luke 22, 21. They do not quote Psalm 41, 9, but they do allude to it. The one who betrays Jesus is a close companion, Psalm 55, 13, identified as one of the 12. And I mentioned Psalm 55, 13 because it's the same thing that's said there in Psalm 55, 13. Doesn't mean that the gospel writers referred to it specifically. Identified as one of the 12, Mark 14, 20, a group who had access to Jesus more than any others during his earthly ministry. He experienced table fellowship with Jesus, this one who betrayed him, but even more spiritual fellowship in celebrating the Passover with Jesus and the other disciples. This betrayal was shocking and treacherous as he was handed over to his enemies by one who was a close companion. The seriousness of this act is shown in the woe that is pronounced on the one who would betray him, Mark 14, 21, which lines up with the assurance of triumph given to the righteous sufferer over his enemies in Psalm 41. Although there was only one betrayer in the formal sense, by dawn, all the disciples would betray Jesus, if not from greed, like Judas, Mark 14, 10 through 11, then from weakness, 14, 37 through 42, fear, 14, 50 to 52, or cowardice, 14, 66 through 62, all from the Gospel of Mark. The abandonment of Jesus by his disciples adds to the humiliation of his suffering. Next category, powerful enemies seeking to destroy the Messiah. David faced a variety of powerful people who wanted to destroy him. In Psalm 3, there are many foes who revolt against David. The word for foes is the word tsar, which is used in situations where the enemy harasses God's people with taunts related to the God they worship. The taunt in Psalm 3 is, there is no salvation for him in God. This could mean that the God David worships is not powerful enough to help him, or it could mean that God does not care enough for David to deliver him. In Psalm 7, David calls his enemies my pursuers. This verb, radaf, is used in the Old Testament when one army is pursuing another army. David has enemies who are trying to chase him down. When one being pursued is innocent, this verb can have the connotation of persecution, as in Psalm 7. The pursuers in Psalm 7 are pictured like a lion stalking its prey, seeking to tear David's life apart, rending it in pieces with none to deliver. As a lion can tear apart a human body with its sharp teeth, so David's enemies are seeking to tear his life apart. David spent the early years of his life on the run from King Saul and his forces. His life was very unsettled as he moved from place to place outside of Judah. He had to leave Judah because Saul was seeking his life. He was trying to find a place of refuge. The pursuit of the enemy made his life unsettled. Knowing that any moment he might be overtaken by the enemy, this is a strong picture of violent men who are seeking David's destruction. Psalm 22 is another psalm that uses animals to describe the suffering of David. It is a familiar lament psalm that opens with the cry of abandonment in verses 1 and 2, and then goes back and forth in the first half of the psalm between affirmations of hope in God and descriptions of David's dreadful experience. You see that at the beginning of Psalm 22, that back and forth statements. It's not exactly clear what situation David is facing, except that it was very serious. In verses 12 through 13, he mentions the strong bulls of Bashan and a ravening, and roaring lion. The bulls of Bashan are strong because they are well fed. Lions are ferocious in the hunting of their prey and the tearing of their prey. They can devour individuals, people, very easily. These aggressive and dangerous animals have trapped David by encircling him, so there is no way to escape. He also mentions that dogs have surrounded him, verses 16 through 18. Dogs in the ancient Near East were not the friendly companions of human beings, not man's best friend back then, but they traveled in groups howling and prowling. Psalm 59:14, looking for food at garbage dumps and carrying disease. They are identified in Psalm 22:16 as a company of evildoers because they do wicked things to the one they have surrounded. They intimidate and frighten by staring and gloating. They see how bad David's situation is, and they're described as waiting for his death. They're fierce animals that circle their prey, closing in on the kill. David describes them as dividing up his garments among them by casting lots for his clothing to express his enemies, to express that his enemies think his end is near. 22:18. David describes his physical situation as near death. Verse 15, he mentions the dust of death. His strength is dried up. His tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth. He's become thin, emaciated, and physically weak. I can count all my bones, he says in verse 17. The enemies seem to have the upper hand. Without God's help, see his appeal in verses 19 through 20, David's life would come to an end. Significant members of the Jewish community were opposed to Jesus. Between Mark 3:21 and 31 through 34, which we looked at earlier in relationship to his family, is an incident where the scribes come down from Jerusalem and accuse Jesus of being possessed by the prince of demons. That would be Mark 3:22 through 30. The scribes are legal specialists, experts in the law, sent from Jerusalem, the seat of temple authority, which means they're sent on an official capacity to oppose Jesus. Instead of accusing Jesus of being deranged, like his family did, they accuse him of being possessed by the prince of demons, from which they claim he gets his power to cast out demons. The Pharisees and Sadducees, two other important groups of Jewish leaders, were also opposed to Jesus because they believed he and his disciples were not adhering to their distinctive beliefs. Many times they questioned him, trying to trip him up. The Jewish people were amazed at his teaching, Matthew 7:28 through 29, and drawn to his miracles, John 6:14 through 15. But they were expecting a conquering Davidic king. The crowd at Passover rejected Jesus for Barabbas, Matthew 27. This accords with John 1:11, which states that even though he came to his own, they did not receive him. Instead, many became his enemies who pursued him by bringing about his death on the cross. The mocking and beating of Jesus by the Roman soldiers before the crucifixion and the taunting of Jesus as he hung on the cross fits David's description of his enemies in several places. David states in Psalm 22:7, "All who see me mock me." Similar mocking statements are made about Jesus. The Roman soldiers who beat Jesus mocked him with both their actions and words. Jesus was naked as well as bruised and bleeding from a scourging when he was made the object of entertainment as a so-called king. They clothed him with a scarlet robe, placed a crown of thorns on his head and a reed in his hand, and kneeled before him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." Matthew 27, Mark 15. As Jesus hung on the cross, he was mocked again by the actions and the words of those at the foot of the cross. Luke mentions three types of people who mocked Jesus. The rulers of the Jewish people scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." Luke 23:35. Not only did they think they had triumphed over Jesus, but they reveled in his misery and gloated over his helpless condition. The soldiers mocked what they thought were false claims about Jesus, saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Luke 23:36. And one of the criminals who was crucified beside Jesus railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." Luke 23:39. Jesus experienced taunting and mocking from those who had position and power, but also from the lowest person, a criminal suffering alongside him on a cross. Psalm 22:6 speaks of one who is less than human, a worm, scorned and despised. Those who mocked Jesus thought he was a fraud. God did not save him. He died on the cross because he was fulfilling the greater divine purpose of the salvation of his people. Hendrickson comments on this. He says they thought it was weakness that kept him nailed to the cross. Actually, it was power, the power of his love for others, that he might save them, sacrificing himself as their substitute, voluntarily surrendering himself to fathomless agonies in order that all who repose their trust in him might be saved. There are also two actions taken at the cross that could be interpreted as scorning the significance of Jesus. The first is that the soldiers at the foot of the cross divided his garments among them in fulfillment of Psalm 22:18. It's not clear that David himself literally experienced his enemies dividing up his garments, which has led to different interpretations or explanations of how these verses in Psalm 22 should be understood. Some point out that David's description of his near-death experience in Psalm 22:14 through 18 really describes the scene of a crucifixion. If David's language transcends his experience and matches Jesus' experience on the cross, prophecy might be a good way to describe it. The soldiers are treating Jesus like a man close to death who is powerless and defeated. Next category, dealing with internal fears, not now external enemies, but internal fears. And we're going to look at Psalm 6 here, and Psalm 22 briefly, and then Psalm 88, and then we'll see how this relates to Christ. So Psalm 6. The focus to this point has been on how David's enemies treated him But we also need to examine the effect on his experience of life. How did false accusations, wicked plotting, being hated without cause, and the evil intentions of others against him affect his physical and spiritual life, his emotions, his internal thoughts, and his psychological condition? Psalm 6 dramatically describes the physical pain and anguish as well as the resulting emotional distress that David experienced being under the discipline of the Lord. Verses 1 and 2. He pleads for grace because he feels weak and faint. His bones are troubled. The verb bahal gives a sense of terror, describing suffocating fear. The next phrase shows that fear has taken root into the very core of David's life. After a plea for God to deliver his life from death, verses 4 and 5, David returns to describe the effect on him of God's delay of action in his situation. Verses 6 and 7, nocturnal episodes of weeping and anguish. The weariness that David experiences, he says, I'm weary with moaning, typically results from hard labor and exertion. David's anguish, expressed in groaning and weeping, has exhausted him. Restless, uncontrollable weeping has resulted in a couch drenched in tears and eyes that waste away and grow weak. David is at the end of his human resources and needs God to act on his behalf. A few brief words about Psalm 22, 14 through 15, which describes the personal disintegration that occurs from the terror of facing fierce enemies and death. David expresses in these verses the feeling that he's falling apart and can't hold himself together as he feels his life ebbing away. He says, I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. He's lost the will to continue because his strength has evaporated. His vitality is gone, dried up like a piece of broken pottery with a tongue that has no moisture so that it sticks to his jaws. He's very close to death when his body will completely dry up and become like dust. God was distressingly absent in the earlier part of Psalm 22, but now he's distressingly present, but active in a death-bringing way. David says, you lay me in the dust of death. Verse 15. A few words about Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is unique in its bleakness, and it's unmatched in its tone of darkness and despair. It's the only lament psalm that does not have a movement toward confidence in God or praise of him at the end. 3 times the psalmist cries out to God in prayer, verse 2, 9, and 13. But in each case, there is only silence. After one glimmer of hope at the beginning of the psalm, God is my salvation, the psalm is full of darkness. It ends in darkness. In fact, darkness is the literally last Hebrew word in the psalm. It's the last word. The situation is not resolved. God is absent and he does not answer. The bitterness of the psalmist's experience is expressed in the phrase, my soul is full of troubles. That may be the verse that is alluded to in the Gospels. Usually the verb full, sava, refers to being satisfied with what is good. But the only thing the psalmist has had enough of is trouble. He's reached his limit and can't take it anymore. Through a series of lively phrases, the nearness of death is described in verses 3 through 5. He's already considered dead, a strong man without strength, like those who are forgotten. The real problem emerges at the end of verse 5 with explicit references to God's role in the situation in verses 6 through 8. Not only has God been silent in response to the psalmist's persistent prayers, but he's also been active in causing the distressing situation. Notice verse 6, you have put me. Verse 7, your wrath lies heavy upon me. In verse 8, you have caused my companions to shun me. Although God has the power to act, he does not act, leaving the psalmist alone and forsaken by all. The third section of Psalm 88, verses 13 through 18, emphasizes God's abandonment of the psalmist and its effect. God has not responded to the psalmist. He suffers terrors that come from God, your terrors, because he feels like he's God's target. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me as he says in verse 16. Instead of being on his side, God seems to be his enemy. Such terrors surround the psalmist like a flood all day, and they are closing in on him, verse 17. God has even caused those who are very close to the psalmist to abandon him, verse 18. And the psalm ends in darkness. Following the Passover, Jesus goes with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. The effect these events are having on Jesus' internal disposition becomes clear. In discussing Christ as a mediator, the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 8, verse 4, states, he endured most grievous torments immediately in his soul. That's the internal fears. It also says, and most painful sufferings in his body as he faced the ordeal of crucifixion. You could also add here, Hebrews, I think it's 5:7, a verse that you need to meditate on it because it describes Christ's experience and his crying out to God. The scripture references given in the Westminster Confession of Faith related to the torments in his soul, Christ's soul, are Gethsemane, Matthew 26, 37 through 38, Luke 22, 44, and Jesus' cry from the cross from Psalm 22, 1, Matthew 27, 46. A critical moment in Jesus' life was in Gethsemane, when the full meaning of what confronted him overwhelmed him with great force. The prospect of dying on a cross would have been terrifying enough, but he also faced the horror of the alienation he would experience in the judgment of God, because he would be bearing the sins of his people. This is the Old Testament cup of God's wrath, the cup of staggering, normally given to sinners to drink. You can see this in Psalm 60, verse 3, Isaiah 51, 17, 22, and there's a host of passages from the prophets. But Jesus, our mediator, will drink it for us. Jesus is besieged with intense spiritual affliction as, quote, he began to be greatly distressed and troubled, Mark 14, 33. The first verb Mark uses, ekthambestai, is a strong term that expresses people's surprise or shock on seeing something remarkable and unexpected. In view of what Jesus is facing, it has an element of fear in the sense of shuddering, horror. The second verb used in 26:37 and Mark 14:33, daimanein, describes, quote, the confused, restless, half-distracted state which is produced by physical derangement or by mental illness. Mental distress, not illness. Mental distress, it is a difference there. As grief, shame, and disappointment. When he states, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death, he uses another strongly emotional term, perilupos, that adds the impression that Jesus is being stretched to the limit of what he can bear. This reflects the haunting lament of the downcast and dejected soul in the Psalms. This also fits the experience of David describing a terrifying fear in Psalm 6:3, my soul is greatly troubled, alluded to in John 12:27, and the statement in Psalm 6:6, I am weary with groaning. The anguish experienced by Jesus has exhausted him. Luke the physician adds a statement about how the internal turmoil of Jesus affected him physically. He says, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground, Luke 22:44. Whether this simile is describing that so much sweat was falling from the Savior that it fell to the ground in great drops, or that the agony that Jesus was experiencing produced a natural physical condition, there is a natural physical condition, hematidrosis, something like that. The point is that the emotional distress within Jesus' soul is so fierce that it produces this physical effect. The darkness that permeates Psalm 88 fits Jesus' experience in Gethsemane in at least two ways. You might be able to see more ways, but at least two ways. First, the horror he experiences in contemplating the prospect of enduring the wrath of God for sin anticipates the cry of their election from the cross. In Psalm 88, 3 times the psalmist cries out to God for an answer. Each time there's only a void of darkness. The psalmist feels abandoned by God. Second, the experience of the psalmist fits the experience of Jesus in Gethsemane as he faces the prospect of crucifixion and how he will be treated. His soul is full of troubles. He's at the breaking point, overwhelmed at what he is facing. Several times death is mentioned in verses 3 through 6, Psalm 88. He's already considered to be one who is counted among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom God remembers no more because he feels trapped without a way of escape. Verse 8, God has caused all his companions to shun him, including a beloved friend, again 88:18. And most significantly, he feels the heavy load of the wrath of God on him. Verse 7, which are accompanied by dreadful assaults, which will lead to his destruction. The cry of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me, comes near the end of his life on the cross. Matthew 27:46. By this time of the crucifixion, Jesus' life is spent as he experiences the process of losing physical and emotional cohesion, which is called disintegration. As expressed in Psalm 22:14 through 15, his life is ebbing away as he's poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. His vitality is gone, dried up like a piece of broken pottery, with a tongue that has no moisture, so that it sticks to the roof of his mouth. He feels the weight of physical suffering, but even more the weight of bearing the wrath of God because of our sin. His cry of being abandoned by God comes just after the 3 hours of darkness. The darkness is a symbol of abandonment, which is also the inevitable sequel to the horror experienced in Gethsemane. Being forsaken by God has several aspects to it. God withheld his help and abandoned Jesus to the unrestrained cruelty of men who became like vicious animals, but he was also abandoned to the power of darkness, a spiritual isolation of terror, as he was made sin, quote unquote, for us, 2 Corinthians 5:21, became a curse, Galatians 3:13, because he was pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah 53:5. In his death, he accomplished our salvation. A model for a life of trust. David was a type of the Messiah David, who was a type of the Messiah, faced difficult circumstances that foreshadowed how Christ himself faced difficult circumstances. What is common to both is that they continued to seek the one who could deliver them from their trials. Even when it looked hopeless, they did not give up hope. A basic response in many of the lament psalms is an affirmation of trust in God that is expressed by two different verbs that overlap in meaning. Both verbs, batach and chasa, express trust or reliance upon someone or something that leads to confidence and security. Of course, in the Psalms, it's trusting in God who brings security. Both verbs are commonly used in the first person to express the psalmist's trust in God and the results. It's also interesting. I found this very fascinating. It's interesting that the Septuagint never translates batach with the word that expresses believe in, pisteuo, but with the word that expresses hope in the positive sense, to rely on God, elpizo. Perhaps this indicates that trust, batach, does not express a full-orbed intellectual and volitional response to revelation, which is expressed in faith, but rather expresses the feeling of being safe or secure. In other words, and I believe Jesus had to experience faith as a part of his trust. I don't want to deny that. But, you know, the whole issue of the faith of Christ is a debated thing. He didn't have faith in order to be justified, right? Okay, he didn't need that. Okay, so we certainly want to be clear about that. But this was just fascinating to me. The Septuagint also translates chasa with hope, elpizo, or a few times in the Psalms with a verb that can be translated as trust, petho. This hope in God is not wishful thinking or complaining, but a confident expectation. That's the emphasis, in other words, that there was hope. expressed in God. This kind of response is demonstrated in Psalm 22, which has been called a model of faithful suffering. After the cry of abandonment in verse 1, David goes back and forth between a description of his horrible situation of suffering and then an affirmation of the character of God as one who delivers his people. And back and forth he goes there at the beginning of Psalm 22. This affirmation is contrary, affirmation of the character of God as the one who delivers his people, is contrary to David's experience, who is mocked because his trust in the Lord has not led to deliverance, Psalm 22:8. Yet David realizes that from the day of his birth, God has been his God in whom he trusted, Psalm 22:9 through 10. On that basis, David appeals to God, "Be not far from me, for trouble is near," 22:11. He then goes on to describe his situation as being desperate, even close to death, 22:12 through 18, followed by another appeal for God to help by quickly coming to his aid to deliver his soul, 22:19 through 20. David does not give up on God, but continues to appeal to him for deliverance. Even when God does not answer, he continues to seek God, which is evidence of his continuing trust in God. Even though Psalm 88 is not a Davidic psalm, the psalmist showed the same kind of tenacity by crying out to God 3 times, even though God did not answer. See, that's part of the point of Psalm 88. He didn't quit. He kept crying out to God. He continued to seek God even in the midst of darkness. Jesus showed the same tenacity when he set his face to go to Jerusalem, Luke 9:31, and when he prayed 3 times in Gethsemane that God would take the cup of suffering away from him before yielding to his Father's will, Matthew 26:38 through 44. He never wavered, even though there were false witnesses brought against him, even though he was stripped of his clothes, beaten and mocked, and even though he's counted as dead and gone. Coming close to death, he still calls God, "My God," in the cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Although the word trust is not used, he never wavered from his hope in God's plan for him. He was secure in his relationship with the Father. This security is demonstrated in the way he died. In Matthew, Jesus' death is described this way, quote, "Jesus cried out with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit," Matthew 27:50. Jesus did not die of physical exhaustion. Now, he experienced physical exhaustion, but he voluntarily gave up his life. He was in control of the moment of his death. In Luke, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and quoted from Psalm 31:5, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Luke 23:46. When Jesus adds the word Father to this statement, he demonstrates the security of his relationship with his Father in heaven. His human body, okay, we're talking about Jesus through all this according to his humanity, right? His human body will go into the grave for 3 days, and his human spirit will enjoy fellowship with his Father in heaven. Jesus did not give up in the trials he faced. He did not call it quits, but persevered to the end. The Gospel of John adds another statement by Jesus at his death, quote, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit, John 19:30. Jesus fully accomplished the work that the Father gave him to do. He completed the salvation of his people. And just as he was secure in his relationship with his Father, so too, we who trust in Christ can know the security that comes through Christ as he brings us into the very throne room of our Heavenly Father. We live in a fallen world that is full of troubles and trials. Jesus even warns his disciples that because we are followers of him, the world will hate us like it hated him. We should not be surprised if we face situations that are hard and overwhelming. In fact, we should be encouraged because we are united to Jesus, who now prays for us that our own trust in God's steadfast love will endure to the end. But more than that, when we find ourselves in the darkness of the pit, we can learn from Jesus, who models for us the experience we see in the Psalms, how we can face enemies without and sorrows within. I will conclude this lecture by 8 statements as to what I think are appropriate implications related to our lives for what we've seen. Number 1, we should be active in praying to God in the trials of life, not afraid to set before Him the details of our suffering and the fears that we have related to suffering. Number 2, we should appeal to God to act on our behalf, recognizing that He is the only one who can bring deliverance in the trials that we face. Number 3, we should recognize that it's not unusual for believers to experience times of darkness when God seems absent and we feel abandoned by Him. That may happen in our lives. Number 4, we should actively seek God in prayer even when it seems the situation is not changing or that He is not listening. Number 5, we must continue to express our trust in God to deliver us from every trouble, finding in Him our security and hope. Number 6, we must live our lives with our eyes fixed on the true destiny that Christ has won for us in the new heavens and the new earth, recognizing that this world is not our true home because Jesus has prepared something much better for us. Number 7, we must live with the reality that the salvation and victory that Christ has won for us will not be experienced fully here in this world, but will be fully experienced when Christ comes again to showcase His victory over sin and death and to defeat Satan himself. Finally, number 8, we must pray for perseverance through the storms of life, even being willing to give our life for the sake of Christ. As we pray, even so, come quickly, Lord. Amen.